Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you're listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
Well, not for you, but for us, we took a few weeks. I got to go down and visit some dear friends, many of whom had coming back from missions experience, and I was really excited about that. Thrilled to be here with my friend Connor, friend and fellow disciple. What's a more tender way I can refer to that? I'll work on it. Beloved, my pal. No. My beloved pal. There it is. I might link with that. Okay. So what we're connecting with today is found in Matthew 17. It's a short section there, 19 verses 19 and 20. So to set the stage, just in terms of the flow of Scripture, if you go back, Jesus says, hey, who do people say I am? And he says, I'm the Messiah. Or Peter says, you're the Messiah. And we had that episode, which I listened to the other day, and I was like, man, that's really good stuff. So, hey, I want to recommend this episode. But anyway, so then Peter immediately, Jesus predicts his own death. Peter immediately pulls him aside and says, hey, you shouldn't do that. And that brings about the get behind me, Satan, which in normal conversation you would assume is a deal breaker, relationally speaking. But then when we switch, it's just a few days later, he's like, we're going to go up on the Mount of Transfiguration, and they see Moses and Elijah. They come down the mountain. They run into the other 9 apostles, and they are trying to cast out a demon of a boy, and they can't do it. And Jesus casts out the demon, and they ask him, they're starting to ask him. I believe we might have covered the other passage where it said they ask him, but this leads to a different conversation in Matthew, so that's why we're going to pick it up here. So we're basically going back in time a little bit, and the guy is walking away with his healed son. The disciples are pulling close to Jesus, and they're going to ask him a question, which sets up his answer. Mm-hmm. In light of all that, anything you think we should be thinking about as we read?
Yeah, so they're going to ask Jesus the question of, hey, and we did talk about this last episode, Mark's recording of this, but Jesus is going to be kind of, I don't know if harsh is the right word, but he's going to say they have, little faith. And I think about in times in my life where I feel like I failed, and there were like obvious consequences, like this situation where the disciples thought they were going to be able to heal this boy, and then they couldn't, and then Jesus comes in and he does it, and they're trying to reconcile what they've done it before, but all of a sudden this time it didn't work out, and what's happening here, and our teacher suddenly comes and he does it, and are we failures? What sort of headspace are they in? We're going to read this interaction here in a moment, and I think it's easy to think about it as like Jesus in a lecture hall, just like giving out, information, but this is in direct response to failure. And so this is a place that if you've been a disciple for any amount of time, you've probably asked God, why couldn't I come through in that situation? Why did I fail? Why did this not work? I thought I understood you. I thought I understood what this was. And so again, I just think it's helpful to remind ourselves this is not a lecture hall. This is Jesus interacting with his disciples who he loves, but also there's some things information, some change in their lives that needs to happen. And so I'm trying to get in a headspace of picturing myself in moments in time where I was in a similar place asking God, hey, why couldn't I come through?
I think that's a brilliant setup. Let's jump right in, because now I have answers to our two always existing questions. Then the disciples came, verse 19, Matthew 17. Then the disciples came to Jesus in private and asked, why couldn't we drive it out? He replied, because you have so little faith. Truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. So, Connor, what amazes you about this brief interaction?
Yeah, so the thing that's coming to my mind is like anytime we get moments where you see Jesus using similar language to previous teachings he's had, and so or even you see the seeds of things he'll say down the road. And so in this example, we have, faith as small as a mustard seed. And to this point, he's already given the parable. And I assume he's giving these parables and these teachings repeatedly. And so he's talking to disciples who would have heard this, probably many times. If not many times, they at least heard it well enough one time to record it and remember it. And Jesus is like, hey, you remember when I had that teaching? Remember when I talked to you about that? And he uses that imagery, uses that metaphor, the parable, to try and teach something. And so, he uses that to try and lead them into better understanding, and ultimately into change. And it's just really, it's really helpful, and it's really helpful for me to see Jesus building on top of previous work, where it's so easy in our discipling or in our own lives to want to be at the finish line, to want to have the complete, full understanding here and now. Want to skip the whole process, want to just, be at the finish line, holding the championship belt, saying, hey, we did it. And it's really helpful for me to see Jesus, Jesus has these teachings, and they're not just teachings that are that are floating above the ground, not connected to actual people in time and place. And Jesus saying this in my mind feels like him being like, hey, this is not something new. This is not something we've not touched on before. And he is purposely drawing them back to not just drawing them to greater faith, but he's drawing them to things he said before, to knowledge he's imparted. And I think it's just really helpful for me, one, in terms of getting a clearer picture of who Jesus is, and his ministry, and of seeing him and his ministry as an actual event that happened in time and space, as opposed to all happening in a lecture hall. But also for the disciples of Jesus is building and building and building, and he seems to be reinforcing his teaching and his lessons, not just with all new revelatory things, but things he's done in the past, and he's weaving them into their situations in that moment.
I think that's really good. I think the idea, and this goes back to the introduction as well. It's like, look, this isn't. I talk about it in terms of how I was taught Jesus and how to behave, how to be a Christian. I would have assumed the book was like a dissertation. Like, okay, here's the problem, and here are all the investigations done, and here are the conclusions and the summary, and it's very organized. Like, how do you lead a church service? I would have assumed in the Bible it says how to lead a church service, and it would be the way we led a church service, And then when you actually start reading the Bible, you're like, oh no, this is organic. And somebody had to look at that and say, well, we don't know for sure, but we're gonna take this section, this sentence from this letter, and this section from the gospel, and we're gonna say we're gonna do it like this. Like, we're gonna have communion like this, we're gonna sing like this, worship like this kind of thing. And it's just not that way. Jesus, and most of it, like the book of Leviticus is an exception, the book of Revelation an exception. Numbers is probably not, or Deuteronomy is probably an exception. But the vast majority of the Bible is God saying, I'm speaking to you humans in a way you'd understand right now, and somehow thousands of years from now they'll understand it too.
And I would even say, even in some of those books, I still think there's very much that.
Even Leviticus,
even Leviticus,
right.
Even Revelation. I think there's pieces of that, and I think it's just incredibly I think it's incredibly powerful to just remind ourselves of that repeatedly, and also go like, man, if the disciples needed this, they were walking with Jesus, they needed to be not just like, it wasn't like Jesus had a curriculum of like, okay, well, this week of the ministry, we're covering, sexual impurity. The next week, we're going to cover greed. And we'll just walk through it and be like, well, hey, when somebody has a question on greed, like, we covered that in week 2. So if you can go review those lessons. No, it's all walking together as Jesus, like, as Jesus is attempting to answer it, all of this weaves together. And that's just, it's incredibly, it's just a good reminder, and it's so human, and it's so easy, like we talk about, to otherize these people, or to pretend like they're just our own little characters that we get to play around with. And yet that's not the case. So what amazes you?
I love the fact that I'm still like, oh yeah, our own little characters play around with. Because I do feel like preachers, so I'm not answering your question just yet, but what you said, yeah, I feel like preachers, like I grew up with preachers kind of shaping these characters like as if they were like co-authors, and attributing things to them. And I've studied the Bible and I'm like, wait a minute, where's that in the text, kind of thing. And then I'm like, oh, how do I do that? So there's that. To your question, I think if we're in a conversation and I say, hey, why didn't that work, Connor? And you go, because you have so little faith. Mm-hmm. I believe that ends the conversation. And what I'm amazed by Jesus is that, all you've got is faith. So to say, it's like corollary to me where in the Proverbs it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. That sounds good. Lean not on your own understanding. It's like, well, what? All I have is my own understanding. I don't have anybody else's understanding. How do I not lean on it? And he's not saying don't use it, but he's saying, he's already established faith is what makes this work. Faith is everything because you have so little faith, period, And now let's go pout in the corner and let that emotional energy dissipate, and then we can act like it didn't happen again. But he jumps right into a promise for them that if you're not careful, you'll see it as a rebuke. But it's a promise. He's saying, like the rest of it, he doesn't have to deliver to them. He doesn't have to remind them of that. And I totally agree with you that Jesus knew how humans learned. And he'd share a little bit and come back to even the Sermon on the Mount. You can read the whole thing in like 7 minutes, So it's not like, think about sermons are mostly 20 to 40 to 60 minutes,
God forbid,
His biggest teaching is, 7 minutes, And so I think it's a little bit here, because he knows how people learn, and he probably repeated himself often. But he doesn't have to say this. But what he's saying is he said, look, nothing will be impossible for you. He's not saying you had such little faith, dummies. He's saying, here's the reason. Mm-hmm. And I want you to imagine the world where that's not the reason anymore. And so I love how he's able to tell them the truth. And this makes me think, how can I do this? How can I tell people the truth and immediately link it to unimaginable hope? Man, your marriage is terrible right now. And it's because you screwed it up. Like it's not, don't even talk about the other person. It's like, you've been selfish, you've been rude, you've been whatever, But to link that, and part of it's because I can't speak it with such authority like Jesus says, it many times, And so that piece of it, I love that about Jesus. I marvel that he's able to tell hard truth. Like if that was just the period and that's it, it's like, where do you go from there? It just feels so harsh.
What do you think Jesus' response would have been? So they asked the question, why couldn't we drive it out? What do you think Jesus' response would have been like? Maybe this is me reading the disciples. That feels like a really a group, like a self-centered. The group is self-centered on like, hey, why couldn't we drive that out? As opposed to like, the father of the boy in the Mark version is like, gotta believe, but help my unbelief. If they were like, if they came to Jesus and were like, Jesus, we believe, like, but like we're just struggling now because we're doubting,
right?
You kind of like, what do you? I wonder what Jesus' response would be if that was more the spirit of their question.
I think that is fascinating, and I think it is it has to be counted. Like you cannot discount that, because I do believe, and we've talked about this many times, had Jesus sleeping, been in the boat, and the apostles woke him up saying, "You're the Lord of everything. Can you do something about this?" Mm-hmm. I think you'd have been like, let's do it. Or it's like, hey, we're really scared. Can you help us? Instead, they wake him up with an accusation. Why don't you care about us? Or Martha saying, make my sister do this. Like when humans try to take control of things, it doesn't matter if they're in speaking truth or not. Mm. It's all about, do you trust God with this? That is the X factor. So yeah, they could have had a very different response. Mm. I think if they had said something like, man, that troubles us because we were trying. How can we do this better in the future?
When you get the sense they did have some sort of faith before, because they thought they were going to be able to. Like they felt, it seemed like from the text, They seemed pretty confident that they were going to be able to do it, and then it doesn't happen. So they do have faith in something. And the issue seems to be with Jesus, like your faith is not directed or oriented into the proper direction. Right.
And I think that taps into a huge discussion on when I do the things of God without the power of God. 2 Timothy, I have a form of godliness, you know what I mean? But it's based on human things. So the things of God are to pray or to preach or to sing or to heal or to serve or to whatever. But if I'm doing that based on my own strength, he may let me have some leeway in it, but eventually he's going to say no, because basically if he doesn't say no, then I'll learn to do Christian practice without Christian power, without trust, because that's what he's after. He's not about the performance. He's about the trust. So what about this perplexes you?
Yeah, so Jesus will use this, he'll say it other times, like if you have, you can have faith as strong as, tell a mountain to throw itself into the sea. And he uses this, here he used the imagery of, you can move a mountain with your faith. And there are some times where like I hear that and I feel like I hear and I understand. And I think I understand what Jesus is trying to say. Then other times, and this is where it's hitting me today, where I'm like, okay, but what does that mean in practice, Jesus? Like, what does it mean for the faith to move mountains? What does it actually look like in the nitty gritty day to day life? Because there are times after the fact where I can see maybe something seemed mountainous, or like I didn't know how I was going to get through it, or I didn't know how that person was going to get through it, and God provided. And, oh, it's so good, it's so good. And so, like, I don't want to dismiss that or say I haven't seen it, because I have. And yet, like, mountains seem to be moved often, which is a miraculous statement, and I don't want to become jaded to that fact. And yet, Jesus seems to teach that maybe this is inaccurate. It seems like Jesus is teaching that we should see mountains moving all the time. And yet I see it sometimes and I don't others. And so like it leads me to believe, because I trust Jesus, that like my perception of this is just not accurate. Not my perception, my understanding or my vision to see God moving mountains is lacking some form of faith. And so that's my perplexion. Long-winded way to get back to, I think one of the first things I said in that little ramble was just like, why don't I see it more? Would Jesus look at me and say, you have little faith? And maybe he would. I mean, certainly in things he would. And so I guess that's my perplexion right now is God help my unbelief, because I've seen you move mountains, and yet you seem to say that there are a lot more mountains that can be moved, and I don't see it.
Yeah. Man, I've got questions on questions about that. Okay, so let me ask you this. Do you perceive this as parabolic? Once he turns his attention, faith as small as a mustard seed, mountain moving, that's a physical description of something spiritual that's happening.
Yeah,
I think that's
a greater a greater reality.
Yeah,
trying to get a picture.
I can't think of an example of a physical mountain moving.
Sure.
Which it's interesting to me, because I would have preferred him to say, honestly, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can participate in the salvation of men, because I've seen that. You know what I mean?
Well, and again, like my understanding of why he would use this sort of metaphor is like, especially we are so disconnected with the land that like, unless you're in Oklahoma, unless you're like driving up into the Rockies or you're going somewhere, like your appreciation for the majesty of what like a physical feature like a mountain can be is pretty low. And again, they didn't have the Rockies. Jesus wasn't, the hills in Israel at that time are not, are not massive rocky mountains. And yet there was like a lot of their imagery is around like the high places, and their appreciation for them and their reverence for them was so high. And so like, I think it is imagery, it is metaphor. I don't think, God could, if he wanted to, like move a mountain like physically. I don't think that's what he's prescribing his followers to do here. They were smart people, right? They didn't think like, I don't think Peter was like, well, gosh, shucks, I guess we're gonna like pray hard enough and Zion is gonna be, the physical is gonna be transported here or there. And so like, I get that. Like, I think they were smart enough, certainly.
I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting you're not smart enough. I want to make sure I want to establish this in my head so I can think from a framing, because I do think there is a part, it is parabolic, we assume, and I think they assumed it. Simultaneously, it's like, I guess then that gives me the freedom or the invitation to think, what is the equivalent spiritually to the moving of a mountain?
Yeah.
And it ties directly back into, and because this is if we were to establish that, then we'd have to then say, okay, is it possible for the mountain, spiritually speaking, to be moving right in front of you and you not know? And I think you insinuated yes.
Yeah.
And so part of that, for me to experience it, I need to have eyes to see and ears to hear. Then I have to ask myself, when I think about, okay, Abraham, father of our faith, which I'm going to go ahead and say, if you just read Genesis, I don't think you'll get to the end of that and be like, father of our faith. I just think you're like, you mean the guy that sold his wife basically twice, 20 years separate? Okay, and he raised kids that
was also willing to take out one of his own kids to ritually sacrifice.
Exactly, So, but God says it, it's true. You know what I mean? He says I'm saved, it's true. So there's that. But how would it feel for him, like when he makes the covenant, where God makes the covenant rather with him? On the other side, then when he woke up from his trance, where's this Genesis 14, where he's like, did he wake up and be like, wow, that was a mountain moving? Or did he say, did that really happen? Like most humans would if you're in a trance and something happened, with Jonah and the Ninevites not being destroyed, did he perceive that as a mountain being moved? I mean, I can, in retrospect. He clearly, at least initially, was like, that's bad news. Because now, anytime a Jew asks me, what happened when you're in Nineveh? I'm like, I spared their destruction, which now everyone hates me in my home country. So that's just, when the disciples are doing something, when they heal one guy as a mountain moved, and then I'm like, what are my standards?
Yeah.
I talked with somebody yesterday, and they were saying it was really wild. They'd lived in Church of Christ for years and years and years and years, and were very indoctrinated in what, if you were raised Church of Christ, you would think of the things. And they said, and I think they were being very bold, and they're saying, I no longer believe this. And they're watching me closely to see if I, as the minister, was going to strike them down. And so it's like, was that a mountain being moved? Them having the courage to say, I've read the Bible and I don't think I've done this right. You know what I mean? So there is that part.
Oh, for sure. And again, like I think if you connect it, you get down into reality. Like you're like, yeah, absolutely. Okay, maybe there are more mountains that like God is now giving me new vision, and that's how. I mean, one of the ways that you can begin to see the underneath currents of what God is doing in the higher realms is by talking to other people, and they help you see and clarify, as brothers and sisters, that is. And even,
right.
But for me, maybe this is the more poignant perplexion, I would say, to fully draw it out. I totally recognize, like, man, somebody who grew up for 50, 60 years indoctrinated, not in a mean way, but just this is the way things are.
Right.
And then suddenly, by the power of God, there's some movement away from that towards the direction of love. You're like, oh, wow, that is a mountain. That's fantastic. But then, of course, and I guess this is just the problem of evil, or maybe not the problem of evil, but just the problem with prayer, is you're like, oh, that's a mountain. But then it's like, well, yeah, but what about the mountains that didn't get, weren't moved, weren't moved in the way that I thought I thought they needed to be moved. Yeah. I said the mountain needed to be moved right, to be thrown into the sea, and God moved it to the left. And I'm like, can I be amazed when I want the mountain to be moved to the right and God moves it to the left?
Yes.
And it's like, on the one hand, you're like, well, how silly, God's moving a mountain. But you're like, yeah, but I had a thought, I had an expectation. There was faith that goodness was going to go, that goodness flowed from the direction that I thought it was going to flow, and now it's not. And it's like, okay, then how do I have faith? Even when the mountain seems to be moved in a way that is maybe even feels more obstructive. I don't know.
Yeah.
And so this is just, I think this is a bigger microcosm of just the daily walk of following a God who is so both knowable and also in so many ways unknowable.
I think that's true. And the thing, man, I know we're running out of time here, but the thing that hits me with this is there's a passage in the Gospels, and I just can't draw it to mind where it is right at this moment, but he's like, hey, if you pray anything, you'll get what you want. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, oh, how can that be? Like, don't say that.
Nobody asked me a question about this.
Yeah, exactly. But then in First John, I think it's chapter 5, he says, if you ask for anything according to my will, it will be done. And I'm like, oh, okay, I can accept that. Now, I really believe that when Jesus is talking to whoever he's talking to there, which I assume is the 12 apostles, it's in the context of according to my will. But he doesn't say that in the sentence. And when you take it out of the context, it's like, well, you should be able to ask for anything, which will lead to total disappointment. You know what I mean? I want there to be justice. I don't want people to be mistreated. I want when people do bad things, want to be held accountable in the gentlest, most teachable way possible to lead them to good life. These kind of things. Not happening. You know what I mean? Bad people go unpunished. Good people get punished. But, it's like, well, now welcome to the life of the psalmist who's like, how long, Lord? And I'm like, I get that. But yeah, these passages, I'm like, is this because I don't have enough faith? Mm-hmm. And that's what perplexes me. And I'm going to give a sort of answer because it's been on my mind. But this goes to, now he said they have little in the boat where he calms the storm. He says, why don't you have faith, or you have no faith? I don't think faith, this is my proposition. I don't think you have like 100% faith, 80% faith, 20% faith. I don't think it's like that. I think it's within this millisecond, in this situation, will you trust God? Mm-hmm. And now you have another chance, a millisecond later. So you cannot trust God at all for 50 billion milliseconds in a row, and then choose in this millisecond to trust God. And he's like, I'll work with that. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And I think that's the mustard seed. It's not the quantity in terms of, I don't even know how you'd evaluate it. Oh, I have, because we say that person has strong faith. What we're saying is we've witnessed that person in multiple milliseconds and they chose God. Or we've heard stories about their life where they chose God and it would be hard for me to choose God, to just believe God will take care of this. And so I think that's what he's saying. He's saying, in those moments that you were trying to heal that kid and cast out that demon, you weren't trusting in God there. And I think that's where he uses the phrase we find it's a matter of prayer, meaning they weren't connecting with God. It's not that they didn't believe in God at all, but they weren't trusting him that. And I say it, you see whatever you see, in yourself, you immediately put on that. Where I've been up preaching and I sit down and I realize I wasn't trusting in God at all with that message. Everything I was talking about was God from the Bible. And yet I personally was relying on my own giftedness, my own talent, my own experience, whatever. And I think that's important to recognize, both in the sense of, it's possible I'm miserable right now because I am not choosing to trust God to give me the fruit of his Spirit. That's very possible. But I think a lot of people, I don't feel his fruit of the Spirit, and so I'll just continue not to trust God for it. And then say, where's God? And then I think it's also good to realize I did not trust God, and now I can, and have a different outcome. And so I can't tell you for sure that's what it is, but it is a perplexing thing when you start talking about faith in this way, little, much. So I go on and on, but that's my perplexion with a sort of answer. So, which is not with the model, but we'll accept it.
Yeah. Well, just because it's been a few weeks and, a little rusty on the rules, but, it's okay. No, I want to respect everybody's time in this situation. Listener, you and me and my family. I won't go in as much as I want, but yeah, that conversation will be a really interesting conversation to have down the road of when the Bible is using the quantity and trying to measure. That sends me into a whole other space that I won't go to, except in my own little mind at 4:00 in the morning at work. Grace, peace, and love.